level, what would you say are the biggest mistakes that most new parents make when bringing up a newborn?
I think overall the biggest mistake is just not trusting in ourselves. I think there's such a high level of stress that parents have. They just don't trust in their inner gut. And to me, we really need to get back to trusting ourselves and trusting what we know to be best for our own family. It seems like there's just so much information out there these days, and it's really hard to synthesize that information for a lot of parents. And so that kind of freezes them and they're not sure what to do. And if we can get back to trusting ourselves and synthesizing that information, I think that can really help. So that's number one. And number two, I think that with the chronic disease epidemic and the direction that our collective health is going, we're not focused enough on the foundations. We're so focused on quicker, faster, cheaper, and not on diet and sleep and exercise and stress, the basic foundations of our health. And so I think the population of our kids, I mean, we can see the statistics, they're getting worse and worse, and it's really scary, and it's something we should be talking about more. And I really don't see a lot of conversation around what's going on for our kids.
And walk us through your background, if you don't mind. Just, let's lay the sort of groundwork in terms of how you come to this topic.
So I'm a pediatrician. I consider myself an integrative pediatrician. So I did all the regular trained in a great program in Los Angeles, Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. But I got a little bit frustrated with the regular system and medications for everything all of the time and not really thinking about prevention. So I started learning about integrative medicine and natural medicine, and also from meeting my wife, who's very holistic minded as well. That really started to push me to start learning about some of these other topics. And so I try to blend the best of both worlds together. I know that integrative medicine sometimes can be thought of as very woo-woo, but it doesn't have to be. There's a lot of research out there, and there's really nothing woo-woo about thinking about your diet. There's really nothing too far out there about thinking about prevention. I mean, that's really how all medicine should be, but we're so focused these days on symptoms and then treatment versus really getting back to, well, what is the root cause? And once you get outside of that, then it's like, of course we should be thinking about that. But I think the system has just been set up in a way where we're not as focused on that anymore.
Yeah. I mean, from my vantage point, there's, and again, I'm not a parent, but I see a lot of antibiotic use among children, infants, toddlers, the schedule under which vaccines are currently administered. There's a lot of controversy there. So maybe you can unpack some of these, more top level issues for us.
Sure. Well, I mean, we can start with antibiotics. Maybe that's an easier topic, and then we can go to vaccines. It's a much less easy topic to talk about. But in terms of antibiotics, what I noticed when I was in the hospital was that we were giving out medications without really thinking about it. It was like, oh, you have a cough, here's your medication, we'll see you later. And I think that's because that's what's in your toolbox. As a doctor, that's what you're trained to use. And when you're seeing 10 patients an hour, you only have so much time. And so a parent wants to do something, and it's very easy to say, well, you have a cough, well, you can take this antibiotic and we'll see you later, and then come back if it gets worse. Versus once you start getting outside of that system and you realize that you rarely need to give an antibiotic because most things are viral. And I used to know all the antibiotic dosages off by heart, no problem, because I gave it out so much. And now in my office, I almost never give them out. It's not never. Sometimes you do need it, but I have to look it up always now because it's so rare. It might be once a month, maybe once or 2 or 3 times a month, which is so different. And yet the kids are just as healthy, if not healthier. And I think that's really important because the research and the data is quite clear at this point that it matters. We know that if you give an antibiotic in the first 6 months of life, that increases your risk of eczema, allergies, autoimmune conditions, basically everything. And again, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it if you need it, and it doesn't mean that you should be terrified as a parent if your child needed these medications, because it's just a slightly increased risk. But we shouldn't just be giving these out just because every medicine can have a side effect, and so you should use these things really if you need it. So
how can parents better advocate for themselves? Like, obviously being a parent can be overwhelming, let alone being a first-time parent. And when your kid is sick, I mean, there's nothing that matters more than bringing that child back to a state of wellness. So how is a parent to best advocate for themselves?
When it comes to antibiotics, this is one of the things I talk about in the book. One of the really important questions to ask the doctor is, do you feel like they really need it? Like, you should know why you're taking the medication. And oftentimes, if you ask the question, do you really think that my child needs this medicine? You're going to get a more in-depth answer. And that's going to be really helpful for you, because the doctor might say, yes, I really do think you need it. I think it's a bacterial infection. It's a pneumonia. It's going to get a lot worse. You need to take this medication. It's strep, and that can have serious complications down the road, so you should take it. Versus what happens most of the time, especially if you go to urgent care, they will most of the time say, well, it's probably a virus, so it's okay if you want to hold on to this, see how it goes for the next day or two, and if it gets worse, then you can take it. And if you do that, most of the time it will get better on its own and you won't need to take it. So I think being an educated consumer of healthcare, being a part of the discussion, and understanding that you really know your child best, and you really know and can advocate for their health. And I think that's so important, that we don't just assume that the doctor is going to do the best thing all the time, or going to have your best interests at heart all the time, or the long-term health of your child. They're obviously, doctors are good people, right? There's no pediatricians out there that are bad people, but it's different when you are in an urgent care seeing 20 patients versus your own child. And sometimes you know your child best. And if you can have that discussion and take that extra 2 minutes, you might be able to save your child from a round of antibiotics, and that matters as it adds up over many, many years and decades.
And what are the potential harms due to antibiotic overuse? I mean, antibiotics, like they can impact the gut microbiome. Walk us through that.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question that I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg of understanding. I am very confident at this point that we know that it affects your gut microbiome, because of course you're killing off the good bacteria and the bad bacteria, and your gut microbiome is an environment. And when you make changes, especially to a child, then of course that potentially could have long-term effects. I think we're very lucky that we're resilient, especially children are resilient, and so things can kind of come back into balance. But if you continually give a medication like an antibiotic over time, it's going to change the gut microbiome, and I think that can affect children in basically every way. I mean, I think that's your internal environment that we're made up of, and so over time, depending on how it changes and depending on what your environment is, then that's one of the big factors that can lead to chronic disease.
And antibiotics are used agriculturally to fatten up cattle. So the idea that we can just give them willy-nilly to our children, I mean, the fact that they're so or that they seem to be so overprescribed today, and in tandem with that, we're seeing such startling rates of obesity, even now in children. There's certainly a correlation there.
I mean, I would say that would extend to basically every medication. I think that we're very lucky that we live in a time where we have all these medicines, because it can save your life. I'm not against pharmaceuticals. I'm not against antibiotics. You can have a pneumonia, which you would have died from 20 years ago, and now you're better, right? And that's amazing. But at the same time, we have forgotten that medications have side effects, and especially when we're talking about kids and giving kids medications every day, like an ADHD medication, like a reflux medication, antibiotics. I mean, these are all, in my mind, very similar in that we give these to kids because they have some symptoms, but it's not a last resort. You're giving to them because, we have some symptoms, the parents are worried, let's just try this. Where there's so many other things that we can try and then use that as a last resort. And sometimes you need it, and that's fine. But I'm not seeing that. And if you look at the statistics and data, I mean, all these medications are skyrocketing right now in kids. I mean, we can talk about 100 different medications that are being given more than they were ever given before by many, many times. And how did we get here? How did we get to a place from 5% chronic disease to almost 50% chronic disease in just a few decades?
If a parent has to utilize antibiotics for whatever reason, is there anything that can be done to mitigate the potential harms?
So there is very conflicting research in terms of probiotics and when to take them and if to take them. I think it's reasonable to do it. I think that is a reasonable thing that we can do, but some of the research says that you should do it in tandem with the antibiotics. Some of it says after. So I think it's reasonable if you want to do some probiotics for a couple of days after, that's fine. At the end of the day, eating healthy to me is really the biggest thing. And I think we need to make sure we get back to having a healthy diet, try to minimize our sugar, try to minimize the chemicals and preservatives to let our gut heal as much as possible. Because I don't think that really any supplement at the end of the day is going to replace good food. I think it can be very helpful to support, but we're eating so poorly in general that we're already starting at such a negative place that just giving a supplement probably isn't enough, but maybe it's a little helpful.
Yeah, children today, last I checked, about 70% of their calories come from ultra processed foods.
Yeah, I've seen research that said even 70 to 90%
Wow.
of their food, and a large portion, I think like 70% of kids don't even get a vegetable or a fruit every day. I mean, the numbers are scary where we are. And, let's say it's just 50% of kids eating ultra processed food. Like, that's still way too much. So it doesn't really matter what the number is. We need to get that down to almost zero or a lot lower. And our food needs to be real food. If it's ultra processed food, then how do we expect them to function? How do we expect their immune systems to work well? How do we expect them not to get sick and not to develop a chronic disease when their bodies don't have the nutrients they need to build and form and to get stronger and grow? I mean, I think that's where we are, and that's why we're seeing what we're seeing.
Walk me through some of the statistics, if you have them.
Sure. So let's see. So, I mean, chronic disease rates of 40, 50%. Diabetes, a third of children have diabetes or pre-diabetes.
One third
of kids have diabetes or pre-diabetes. And one of the things that's really interesting about diabetes, especially type 2, is, of course, it's called adult onset diabetes because it's something that used to be seen in adults. And if you go back and you look at the research and the data, which I did for a talk on diabetes, there's almost no data on kids with type 2 diabetes, even 50 or 100 years ago. Like, you can't find it. And now the average age of onset is 13.
Wow.
Just nuts. Teens, 50% of teens are overweight or obese. 25% of kids, 25% of kids are overweight. I mean, those numbers are insane. Like 1 in 5 kids. How did we get there? Like 10% of kids have anxiety. 10% of kids have eczema. 10% of kids have allergies. Our autoimmune conditions are skyrocketing. I mean, these numbers, when you step back and you look at them, it's so obvious that there's a lot going on that's an issue. And if we want to have a healthier future and a healthier generation, then we need to do something about it. And one of the things I know that you're talking so much about is dementia, which I think is fantastic. And I've heard you speak about it and kind of talking about how we have to go backwards in time and think about these things earlier, which is so important. I had grandparents that had dementia as well, so I know how much that can affect them and the family. And I couldn't agree with you more about the fact that we need to be thinking about these things in our 40s and our 50s and our 60s. But when I talk about this stuff for parents, I mean, the reason why I chose this book in that age range of 0 to 3 was to talk to parents to get ahead of this. And I think it's the same conversation. I mean, just going all the way back to the beginning, all of this chronic disease, it's all related, and it's all the things that we're doing from before you're pregnant to when you're a baby, as you're growing up. And that's why the numbers keep increasing, because I would guess most of the things you would find that would be inflammatory in terms of your brain, in terms of dementia, are probably similar things that are happening in kids. And it might express itself in different ways, or it might express itself later as dementia, but it's the same conversation. And most integrative practitioners are saying the same things, and we have to think about our food. We have to think about what we're doing, and it's not rocket science. It's pretty common sense, but it has to be done at this point, or we're going to see more dementia, more autoimmune conditions, more of everything.
Yeah. I mean, if dementia is the result of midlife obesity and midlife hypertension and midlife type 2 diabetes, and you're saying that the staggering obesity rates that we're seeing in children now is a relatively new phenomena, who knows how that's gonna play out in terms of midlife health, I
think it's not going to be good. I mean, I think, you look at the numbers in terms of how many adults are on medications. It's like 40, 50, 60, 70%, depending on which studies you're looking at, some 5+ medications. And you have teen mental health diagnoses of 50% of teens by the time they're 18 have a mental health diagnosis.
Wow.
1/3 of girls have thought about suicide. 1 in 10 have tried. I mean, again, like I'm saying this over and over again, but those numbers are very scary. And what's that going to be like in midlife? That's not where we want to be as a population. We're not moving in a better direction, and we can change it. We absolutely can, because these things have grown in numbers so quickly, which means to me that it's so obvious that it's environmental. And the good news there is, because it's environmental, that means we can do something about it, and we can change it, and we can move it to a better direction. And it doesn't mean we should throw out all of modern medicine, because there's a lot of things we do that are great. But we also have to have a little humility and take a step back and look at what's going on with our health and say, well, maybe we're not so great at chronic disease. Maybe we need to make some changes that go back in time a little bit and do some things like our grandparents did, or think about how we're getting our food, or what our food, or where our food's coming from. And it doesn't seem like we're doing that at all in modern medicine. And I think that's going to be a change that's needed for people to move in a different direction. But at least right now, and this is why I talk to parents, you have control over your family, and there's a lot that we can do, that parents can do for their own kids and for themselves, that can make a big difference. And I think that's where it starts.
That is definitely where it starts. The Associated Press in May of this year, 2024, reported that use of Wegovy and other weight loss drugs are soaring among kids and young adults. Mm-hmm. What do you make of that?
It's one byproduct of the obesity epidemic. I mean, this is true for kids and for adults, and it's really unfortunate that we're looking for a quick fix. There are no quick fixes, and these medications are very strong, and sometimes they might be needed or can be useful, but this is a byproduct of the obesity and overweight epidemic, and I think this is going to be a huge problem in a few years. I think that we're using a medication without a lot of forethought of what it's going to be like long term. There's almost no way you can put a 15-year-old on a medication that has that drastic of an effect on your body, and you're going to be on it for 5 or 10 or 15 years, and we're not going to see some serious side effects down the road. Can it be useful in the short term? Sure, it definitely can, but what is that going to mean for your liver? What's it going to mean for your kidneys? What's it going to mean for you in your 20s or 30s or 40s if you're taking this medicine every single day? I mean, it's very short-sighted in many ways, and I think it's a big problem that we are just willing to give our kids these medications instead of spending the time to do what really needs to be done, which is to change the lifestyle, change the schools, change the food, and that is what would actually help kids to sustain themselves long term. But I mean, I think it's like everything else that we've seen over the last few years. You know, it's a fad. It's something that's going to be here, and people are going to use it, and then they're going to start to realize more and more that there are problems with it, and then it will slowly start to decrease. And some people will still use it, but I mean, I've heard of many lawsuits and other things coming up the pipeline for serious side effects that haven't been discussed. And I know a lot of people that have used it that have come off it pretty quickly. So for sure it helps some people, but I think the side effects are vastly underreported, and it's one of those things that we're going to learn a lot more about in probably 10, 20 years once the lawsuits go all the way through, but it takes a long time.
Yeah, it does take a long time. I mean, if I were the owner of an overweight pet, I would try to improve its food quality, and I would try to feed it less. Mm-hmm. Applied to children, do you think that's an oversimplified analogy?
Well, I don't think it's an oversimplified analogy. I think that's what we need to do, but it's not as simple as that when it comes to a child, especially as they get older, because you don't necessarily have full control over them, which you shouldn't, right? I mean, obviously the teenagers are going to be doing what they want to do, and we're not controlling all of their food, but I do think that we need to go back to a place where we feel like we have some control. One of the things that's really frustrating to me about many topics in health, but especially with obesity, is that if you talk about it, people get mad at you. They get mad at you for talking about it like, this should be okay, we shouldn't talk about it. It's like, I'm a doctor. I want to talk about health and what's going to be healthy. It's not to shame somebody or to body shame anybody or to say that you're not beautiful or whatever it is, but it's not healthy. We know there are a very long list of risks from being overweight or obese, and so trying to help people to get back to a better place is what we're supposed to be doing as doctors and what we're supposed to be doing as wellness practitioners. And as soon as you talk about it, you get attacked. And I'm used to it at this point. It's fine. People can attack me all they want. But we need to take our power back. I mean, there was a whole discussion in the American Academy of Pediatrics and a whole debate for a while about surgery. Like, bariatric surgery is one of the primary things that, you know, we're supposed to be offering now for kids, and all these medications kind of came out after that discussion. But the discussion needs to be around how do we prevent this from happening, not what surgeries do we do for a child who's overweight or obese, because it's just going to be a cycle. It's going to happen again. If we don't fix the problem, we're not solving anything with a surgery. We're not solving anything by a medication. Maybe it's a Band-Aid, but if there are mental health concerns that need to be addressed, we need to address them. If there are food insecurity issues, we need to address those. If there's food cost issues, we need to address those. And that's what we really need to do. Of course, it's not easy. It's not simple. But if we want a healthier future, then promoting medications and promoting surgeries is not the way to go. It's fine to talk about it as an option because I think that some kids do truly need it. But what really needs to happen is I think all the doctors need to get together and all the health professionals need to get together, work as a team and say, this is not working. We need to figure out and get a ton of money from the government, from wherever, and put our focus back into what are we going to do to have a healthier future than we have now? What are we going to do for our kids? And until that happens, until the focus is on prevention and long term, as opposed to, government cycles or 4 years or whatever it is, like it can't be something that's short term. It can't be a discussion of something that's going to be fixed tomorrow because it won't. I mean, you know this. You cannot fix what's gone on for a long time in one day. That's what a medication does, but it's a Band-Aid. It doesn't really get to the root of the problem.
Yeah. What would you say are the biggest frustrations from the side of parents? Like what seems to be, because, having a child is super difficult. You're not sleeping, it brings about a slew of expenses. It's a very expensive process raising a child. You're inundated with advice and information, some misinformation on social media. So I would imagine it would be a really frustrating experience for parents.
It can be very frustrating. I mean, a lot of being a parent is wonderful and magical, but a lot of it is not too. I mean, I think that it is really hard to know what information to trust these days. There's so much information. I think it was probably easier in many ways to be a parent 100 years ago because you just ask grandma, oh, well, what did you feed me? Oh, you did that? Okay, I guess I'll do that. And now you have to talk to your family, and then you look online at some influencer, and then you look online at a doctor, and you talk to your doctor, and everybody gives you completely contradictory information, and then you're not really sure what to do. And so we've never really been taught, especially as parents, how to synthesize information, or even just that we should trust our gut. I mean, I think that's gone. I've noticed that as a pediatrician, that parents don't trust themselves, even on the simple things anymore, even on things they for sure know the answer to. They want to just double check because they don't trust their gut anymore, because they see something online and then they don't want to miss something. They don't want to do something wrong. They don't want to be the cause of the issue. And when you step back, you really realize that there's no right answer to parenting. There's no one way to do almost anything. Having information certainly can be helpful to help you make a decision, but at the end of the day, most of the time you're just trying things, you're seeing what works, and then you're continuously in the loop figuring out what works for your kid and then making changes based on what you're seeing make sense for them and that child. And that's where the title of the book comes, Parenting at Your Child's Pace, because we are so quick to compare these days when it's really important to focus back on our children, focus back on our family. Because even when you have two kids, whatever worked with the first kid isn't necessarily going to work with the second kid. So you don't need to know the right answer because there's no right answer most of the time. If you trust your gut, then that's going to get you most of the way, the vast majority of the time, and use that information, synthesize it, trust yourself, as opposed to what the influencer says online. You can listen, you can learn, but they don't know your family. You do.
Yeah. You do have to trust yourself. My niece, my 2-year-old niece, she's my brother was having an issue where she's not really eating all that much. She's not like eating enough. So she was like, underweight, not underweight, but she's like
in the lower end, yeah.
At the lower end or something. I mean, she's a perfectly healthy weight, but I guess at the lower end of the healthy range. And they realized that it's because they're allowing her to snack all day whenever she wants a snack. She's got snacks at constant disposal, and that's causing her to not be hungry around meal times. And so they've started to realize that they have to be a little bit more strict. They have to impose a degree of discipline about, if it's not mealtime, then we've got to curtail the snacks, so that you're actually hungry when it comes time to sit down and eat something nutritious. Is that consistent with experiences that other parents may have had?
Yeah, definitely. As the kids get older, I think having more set meal times is really helpful. And it's also, you even brought up a bigger point there of just setting boundaries in general. I mean, when our grandparents, it was like very authoritarian, like it's my way or the highway, spanking, all that stuff. And then it really moved the other way. And a lot of our generation, parents' generation, it's very permissive, like kind of no boundaries, do whatever, run around. You see it in the restaurant sometimes. The kids are throwing stuff, and the parents are not setting any boundaries or telling them to stop. And the right answer is usually in the middle. It's almost always in the middle. And it's not that we want to be too strict with our kids, but they thrive on boundaries. We need to create appropriate boundaries for them. And I think that's okay. And parents need to feel empowered again, that they do know what's best for their children, and it's okay to set some boundaries. Even if they're upset at you for 5 minutes, they'll get over it. But if you're setting them up for success, you're creating good boundaries that are reasonable boundaries for them that help them to thrive.
What can parents do about picky eaters?
So for picky eaters, there's a few things, but to me, number one, it's to keep trying, right? That's number one, is always keep offering food to those kids, because the research shows that sometimes it takes 10, even 50, 100 times before they'll eat something. So just because they didn't eat it today doesn't mean they won't eat it in a couple years from now. So keep offering it. Don't force them to eat it, but have it on their plate so they can try things. A great tip that tends to work for a lot of parents is giving the children the food that you want them to eat first. So if you're preparing a meal, preparing dinner, if you want them to eat some carrots and you put it beside the steak, then they're oftentimes going to avoid the veggie and just eat the food that they want more. So if you give them while you're preparing, like, oh, you want some, you're hungry? Okay, here's some carrots, here's some celery. They're much more likely to eat that if it's the only thing available. And you say, oh, the rest of the food's going to be, here in 5 minutes. And that tends to work. Taking them with you really works as they get older. So taking them to the grocery store with you so they can choose, especially if you have a farmer's market around, that could be really helpful, because a lot of kids might not like an apple, but there's 50 different kinds of apples, and maybe if you try 10 different ones, they're going to like one. So I think that can be really helpful. And for the younger kids, using the rainbow, so different colors and trying to get different foods each day or different colors each day, that can be a fun game to try to get them to eat different foods. So those are some things that tend to work for picky eaters.
Children, I would imagine, will preferentially choose the more palatable, sugary or grain-based, starchy foods as opposed to the protein, if I had to guess. Which
Depends
is
on the
obviously
child.
not in there.
Depends on the child.
Really?
But I think that most kids, yes, they will go towards the bread and the pasta and the sugary foods as opposed to the healthier foods.
What would you say are the most important foods to prioritize for children?
I think healthy proteins as well as veggies and fruits. I think it's the same for everybody, right? It's not that complicated. We need to get away from all the sugar, all the processed foods, all the chemicals. Any long word that you don't know what it is probably not very good for you. And when I talk to parents, and I get asked all the time, like, what's the one thing that you would say that we should do? It's to read labels. Start reading labels. Read the label on everything. You don't need a PhD. If you don't know what the word is, it's probably not good for you. And if you start doing that and you start becoming more mindful, then that gets you a long way, because it's the small things that matter. It's not eating one piece of cake. I'm not an all or none kind of person. I think it's reasonable that if your kid's at a party, they eat a piece of cake like the other kids. But if you're eating that every single day, it really adds up. So if you make small changes, that to me is what's going to get us most of the way there for our kids.
There are some controversial foods like peanuts and honey. Like there's some, I guess more traditional wisdom that, these are foods that you might choose to avoid early in life. But we've had other guests on the podcast suggest that advice has caused many children to develop sensitivities that they wouldn't have otherwise developed.
Yeah, to me, the last things that I would be worried about would be real food like honey. There's so many other bigger issues out there, but at least in terms of honey, the theory from the pediatric perspective of not eating that in the first year is because of the risk of botulism. So that's why that is said not to be done in the first year. And then peanuts, so that's actually gone completely the other direction at this point. It used to be that the wisdom was to wait. Now most of the research shows the earlier you expose it, the better. So most people are exposing their kids at around 6 months, which I think is good. And it makes sense. I think your body needs to be exposed to most things so it doesn't think that it's foreign.
Yeah.
And that's where most of the allergy research has gone. So I think we kind of moved the other direction. But to me, if I'm going to be worried about food, it's not going to be about anything that's a real food. I'm going to be worried about all the other stuff that you talked about, the ultra processed food. That's what we're in big trouble with right now.
Are there any whole foods that would be off limits that might be counterintuitive to non-parents?
I don't think so. I mean, that's not where I spend my time when talking to parents. Sometimes people will ask me about this food or that food or starting with this or that. And to me, it's like, if you're eating a real food, you're so much farther along than everybody else. Let's be realistic with what we need to be worried about, and just rotate. You eat different foods, try different foods. If you're eating the same thing every day, that's where you're going to run into trouble, I think. If you're eating different whole foods, then you're very unlikely to run into trouble. from that, and spend your time trying to get the best quality food you can, fresh fruit, get to know your farmers if you can, go to a farmer's market. That's, to me, where I would put my effort, as opposed to worrying about every little detail, because the information changes so frequently anyways. It's so hard to know. And that's very tough as a parent, because you give your kid a carrot today, and then you read an article tomorrow that says carrots are so bad for you, you should never give carrots. So then you're like, what do I do? But I would say just eat real food. Carrots are probably fine.
Yeah. Great for your, beta carotene, great for your eyes. Yeah. Super, super great advice.
Did you want to talk about autism and vaccines? Because I know you mentioned it a while ago. We kind of got way away from it, and then I know you wanted to.
Yeah, I would love to. Yeah, well, vaccines. It's a hot button topic, which I don't think it should be. I think we should be able to have these kinds of conversations. But yeah, there's a lot of, perhaps misconceptions about them. I'm certainly not like an anti-vaxxer in any sense, but there are people. Everything today has become so polarized,
Mm-hmm.
So what's your take as an integrative pediatrician?
Yeah, when it comes to vaccines, it seems to be the most controversial topic that there is, and I don't know why we've gotten here. There should be no topic that's off limits. We need to be able to talk about it. And the only way that we're going to get to a better place where people are informed and can trust anything is if we have discussions. And there's nothing more frustrating than that topic, because as soon as you bring up anything, it devolves into an argument. Either it's because of the vaccines, that this issue happened, or, I can't believe you're talking about it. It's an anti-vaxxer thing. And I'm not pro or anti anything. I don't think that makes any sense. I'm pro health, pro children, pro having discussions and figuring out what makes the most sense for your family and your child. And unless we're able to have conversations about everything, we're never going to get to a better place. And there has never been a greater distrust in medicine at this point. Any of the research that shows where the trust is in the healthcare system has just plummeted off the edge over the last few years, because I think people are not getting the information that they need. And so they feel like, if I'm not hearing information, I'm not hearing discussions, if I'm just being told what to do, well, what are they hiding from me? What are they not telling me? And I think if there were more open and honest discussions, we'd be in a much better place. And I'm not against anything. I just think that we should have conversations around it. And I'm trying to talk about it a little bit more, because I think we need to. If we want people to be comfortable doing anything, if we want the best possible outcomes for our kids, then we shouldn't trust a pharmaceutical company. We should trust research and science and doctors and everybody to come together to do what's best for our kids. And if we don't discuss it, then how do we know if we can make it better? How do we know if we can make it safer? How do we know if there are things that we could do to help our kids to get to a better place, as opposed to saying, no, everything's perfect. Well, nothing in medicine is ever perfect. Everything has side effects, and everything can be made better.
I really appreciate that. Do you think there's value in delaying the schedule?
So, when it comes to the schedule, as a doctor, the only thing that you can really recommend is the CDC, American Academy schedule, because that's the only thing that's been studied. But I feel like, again, this is one of those things where we should have more discussions on it. We should talk about it. We should get more research to decide if there are better ways or different ways to do things for kids. I take care of all kinds of patients, and so some people do delayed schedule, some people do the regular schedule. People do all sorts of different things. But is it better or worse? I don't know. There's no answer to that question, because there's no research on it that I know of.
Interesting. So how is then a parent, where does a parent even begin to do that kind of research?
It's very hard, because people ask me those questions, and in the office it's really just discussions. There are some books out there, but most things are very one-sided. You can go see the CDC and American Academy information, so you can get the advice that's been recommended by those societies, which I think is very valuable, and you need to take that into account, most certainly. But then anything else is going to be very much on the other side. And so it's really hard when you're in the middle, which I think are most people. Most people are in the middle somewhere, where they want to do what's best for their children's health, and they are just not sure what that is anymore. And they have questions, which you should have as a parent. You should have questions about everything you do. Certainly if you're going to give your child 30, 40, 50 of something, you should have questions about that. There's nothing wrong with that. And we should be able to have discussions to encourage people to do whatever we feel is best for them. And intelligent people can disagree on what's the best thing to do for a child in terms of their long-term health, but everybody has the same goal, right? Which is healthy children. And if that's what we want, then we should have discussions, not get angry at somebody who has a different opinion, and debate it and discuss it. And if there aren't answers to certain questions, try to figure those answers out. And if we just trust research and data that a company has done for 6 months, 2 weeks, 2 years, we don't have data anything long-term. And then there are a lot of people that are concerned about long-term complications from medicine in general, and we don't have the research on it because who's doing it? So how do we know? How can you say that we do or do not have eczema as a long-term complication from a medication? Or, you talked about, the like Ozempic and things like that. It's like, well, what if it causes serious cancer in 20 years? How do we know? You can't say that it doesn't unless you do that kind of research. So you can only give information based on the best information that we have, which is fine, as long as you're open and honest with it. But I don't think that we're open and honest with these things. I think it's more like, oh, just do things, just do it. And that's not okay. I mean, I think we need to have discussions to encourage people and discuss it and help them decide what's best for them, as opposed to telling people what to do.
Yeah, and medicine so rarely addresses where, as an establishment, it's been wrong. We've seen that over the past certainly 4 years, and so I think it's really important to have these conversations. Do you have rates of autism have they increased? Is it just that we've gotten better at diagnosing it? From my vantage point, it seems like we're seeing a lot higher rates.
Yes. So my opinion, based on the research, is that it is much higher than it ever used to be. If you go back many decades ago, it was like 1 in 25,000. Then it dropped down to 1 in 150 a couple decades ago, and then 1 in 40. Then the last I saw was 1 in 36, but 1 in 22 in California. And
1 in 22,000 or
1 in 22?
1 in 22.
2 children, yes, in California. 1 in 36 overall. So that's where we are now. And to me, it doesn't make any sense that it would be just based on the fact that we're better at diagnosis. Absolutely we are. So there's no question that that's a part of it. But we did not go from 1 in, 1,000 to 1 in 22 over a couple of decades just because we're better at diagnosis, especially when you consider that 20 to 30% of children with autism are nonverbal. Where is that 20 to 30% of kids 50 years ago? Like, they would maybe have a different diagnosis, but they would still be there. So I think it's just happening more. And I think, it's another very frustrating topic, because when you say that, it, again, causes a lot of controversy. People get really upset about it. But if we don't describe the problem and we're not honest about it, then we're never going to do anything to fix it, because it's like, oh, it's just normal. It's just happening. As opposed to, this is happening. It's getting worse. There is more and more severe issues. There are a lot of kids that are having significant difficulties and a lot of families that are having significant difficulties. What can we do to help those families? And there are things that can be done some of the time, for sure, because I've seen it. I've seen it myself. I've seen it in the research. I've seen kids lose their diagnosis. I mean, it is possible for sure sometimes.
I'm sure you've seen the recent headlines. There was it was a case report of twins, and one of the twins was put on a minimally processed, gluten-free diet. I forget if there were other interventions, but at least in terms of this case report, they reported a dramatic reversal, quote-unquote reversal of symptoms.
Yeah, so that was Documenting Hope. I'm actually an advisor with them. I was not part of the study, but I'm a part of that community. And it's a really interesting study. They took 2 20-month-olds, and they had pretty severe autism, and over 3 years...
At 20 months, can you already see that?
You can see it. So, it's usually like questionnaires, and the practitioners will do assessments to assume. And they were pretty high on the autism scores based on the checklist that they use. So presumably, yes. You're having communication issues, repetitive behaviors, gut issues. So there are things that they can certainly... You can either get the diagnosis or have a presumptive diagnosis that potentially expresses itself later. But they basically did the whole gambit of things. They did all sorts of studies. They change up their diet. They change up their lifestyle. They work with functional integrative practitioners. And over 3 years, they went from very high scores to almost non-existent scores. I think it was like 70 to 30 or 40, and it was like 40 to 4, with those scores, which I'm not an autism. I don't do the diagnoses, but it's a pretty significant difference over that short a time. And again, that gets back to the fact that there are things that we can do sometimes. And a lot of the discussion tends to be around genetics. And of course, genetics plays a factor. But when you see studies like that, when you see kids like that, it's really unfortunate and frustrating that that's not the discussion that parents are hearing. Because if they heard that, then maybe they would make some changes in their life, and maybe they would help their kids to get to a better place. But if you're just told this is normal, this is how it is, then you're not going to change up your diet. You're not going to do things differently. And it's not about blaming or shaming. Again, I think that's where we're running into issues, is that if we say that it's a lifestyle disease, that means that you did something in theory, that a parent did something, that there's something we could have done differently, that something caused this, as opposed to it just being genetics. And that's not the right angle to take. Nobody's blaming anybody. We need to learn about what's going on so that way we can prevent it from happening in the future and help these kids as much as possible. And with everything in parenting and everything in life, we learn as we're moving forward, and we do better based on knowing better. And if there's anything that we can do to make children healthier and happier, why wouldn't we do that? Why would we run in the other direction? There's just no reason to do that in my mind. I mean, we're all on the same team.
Absolutely. There was another study that came out very recently. It found that I think parents that were had the more closely parents, could have been just the mother, I'm not sure, I don't remember, but had adhered to a Mediterranean style dietary pattern, it was a dramatically reduced risk of having offspring that had autism. And there's obviously, there could be healthy user bias there. Somebody who's, more closely adhering to a Mediterranean dietary pattern, probably more likely to exercise, take a multivitamin, for example. So I don't know if we can, tease out the specific variable that may have been causally related to that effect. However, when I posted it, when I shared about it, I was shocked at the pushback that I had gotten from parents. Like some of the replies that I got in my DMs were actually quite vitriolic. How could you possibly suggest that this is,
Oh yeah, I'm used to it.
a lifestyle mediated condition?
Well, I think some of that comes from the fact that there are a lot of adults that have got the diagnosis later in life, and so then they're kind of within that world of autism trying to push back and say that it's just something that is, they don't want it to be a lifestyle disease. But I think the issue is that even just by that nature, the adults that are getting that diagnosis, discussing, sending you the mean messages, those are not the same thing as the kids that are unable to talk, unable to function, that are hurting themselves. Like it's a very different population. And I think that you almost have to separate it a little bit, because some kids with autism are absolutely brilliant. Like they're savants. They're even so there's a wide range of what it means. And autism's not a genetic diagnosis in terms of like, we take this test and we know you have autism. I think there's a lot of genetics involved, but we're not there yet. And I think autism is probably many, many things. It's probably caused by a variety of different chemicals, toxins, lifestyle factors, that it's probably 10, 20, 50 different things. And we call it autism because they have similar symptoms, or maybe the chemicals and toxins are creating a syndrome that we call autism. But I think we almost have to break it apart at this point into multiple different things.
Yeah, what you're saying is it's not a monolith. And while some people may be extremely high functioning and have owned and are proud of their diagnosis, there are some who are nonverbal. And,
right. And supporting and loving and discussing one group doesn't negate the other group. I mean, they're both probably true. And when you look at diabetes, you have type 1 and type 2. And especially with type 2, if you change up your lifestyle, we know, and that's like pretty common knowledge in medicine, like, exercise more, eat healthier, you lose your diagnosis. That's probably true of almost every condition at this point. All the autoimmune conditions, autism. I mean, I think we need to start thinking about type 1 and type 2 of everything. And I think that might be helpful for parents, because I do think for autism, yeah, there's probably some kids that it's completely genetic or mostly genetic, and no matter what we do, they're still going to have the condition. Maybe you can still help their functioning, but you're not going to get rid of the diagnosis. But there's probably a huge subsection of children that it's completely lifestyle. And if we support them and help them to change their lifestyle, they're going to lose their diagnosis. That is my guess, based on what I'm seeing, and based on the fact that kids do get better and do have a huge shift in their symptoms to the point where they lose their diagnosis. I've seen that happen in my own office, and I work with many practitioners that say the same thing. So you can't say that it's all genetic when that happens.
It's very frustrating. It reminds me of Parkinson's disease. I've done a lot of research on Parkinson's disease as of late, and I've been exposed to a whole new line of thinking with regard to the environmental factors that may trigger the condition. But one thing that was really startling to me was, most of the research dollars that go into researching Parkinson's disease go into the heritability of the condition, when there is very low heritability for Parkinson's disease. A fraction of the research dollars go into the environmental factors, the diet, lifestyle, environmental triggers, and the like. The vast majority goes into the genetics of the condition.
Well, most likely because you can treat that. You can look at that, you can figure it out, you could do a test. I mean, it's really hard to change the lifestyle, but anybody you talk to who talks about any of these conditions, who's in the integrative world, we're all saying the same thing, but it's a really difficult thing to change. The world is the way that the world is, and unless we come together, unless we have some big shifts, it's a really uphill battle. And it's tough for parents because, you can listen to this and you're like, okay, fine, but then what do I do? Right? It's tough. It's tough when you hear, oh, well, everything is chemicals, everything is toxins, everything is a problem. All right, I guess I give up. And that's not the right attitude to have. I really try to empower parents that every little bit matters, every little bit adds up. And there was a great study I talked about a few times I loved from Harvard. It was the SOUP study. I don't know if you're familiar with that study, but it was a great study about BPA. And they took a bunch of patients and they gave them 5 days of canned soup. And then after that, they gave them 5 days of homemade soup. And they were looking at BPA in the urine because the canned soup had BPA lining. And the difference over those 5 days in the urine was 1,000%.
Wow.
1,000% in 5 days. So to me, that is such a great study because if you kind of step back and you look at it, like that's just one chemical, just for a couple of days, but that little change gets rid of that chemical by 1,000%. And yeah, probably in 5 days, it's not going to make that much of a difference to you. But if you're eating that every day over the next 10 years and you add in every other chemical and every other decision that you're making and you're not thinking about these things, of course it adds up. And of course we're getting to a place where we're running into a huge issue. I mean, there was just a big study on BPA that came out of Australia. It was like 2,000 moms and boys, and they were looking at the BPA levels in moms in pregnancy, and they found that the high levels of BPA were related to autism. So by 2, they were related. You had 3 times increased risk of having autism in the boys if the mom had a high BPA level, and by 10, it was 6 times. So that's just one chemical. So that is where, to me, it's like if you see this chemical and you look at metals, there's so many things that seem to be related to autism. So there's probably many things that are doing it, but it's probably the accumulation of all of these things that are leading to it in our kids.
Yeah, these exposures don't occur in isolation.
Right. And when we're talking about something as huge as autism, we need to figure out why. That we have to do that for our kids. We have to figure out, we have to step back and we have to not have a bias that we all have. We have to have some humility. We have to let everything be on the table, and we have to figure out, all right, these are the top 10 things that you should do as a parent. These are the highest risk of correlation between autism and the things that we're doing, whatever those things may be, and then start to minimize that and work our way back if we want to go in a different direction. But right now, you read one study, it says one thing, you read another study, it says the opposite. It's really hard to know what is or isn't related or causative or correlative to autism, and it's such a huge problem, yet we know so little.
What do we currently know about autism risk factors?
So the biggest one is as far as I've seen, is paternal age. So that's a big one. Maternal age also, I saw a recent study that showed that. So the older the dad is, the bigger the risk. Then the older the mom is, the bigger the risk. But also, interestingly, older dad with very young mom actually had the highest risk for whatever reason. I don't know. That was a big study out of Australia, I think, which was interesting. So that's one big category. Pollution's another big category. So especially living by a freeway, there's been many studies I've seen at this point that showed that if you live very close to a freeway, I saw one that was if you're within 1,000 feet of the freeway, so a couple like football fields away, then you had a 3 times increase of having autism. So that was an interesting correlation. There's correlation between a lot of metals and some of the research. So cadmium, arsenic, mercury, aluminum, of course, the most debated depending on what you see. So because of the fact that there's aluminum in autism, that research is kind of difficult because a lot of research says that it's not related, but then some things say that it is. So But metals in general are certainly correlated in many studies. So that's one. Pesticides, the glyphosate has been correlated with it, and maternal infection. So there's a few things in when mom's pregnant. So infections, fevers, multiple diabetes, preeclampsia, all these things seem to be related, and then nutrient deficiencies in mom or the child seems to be related. So those are the big categories that I've seen when I've looked through the research, but almost nothing is definitive. There's very little that's like, well, we know this for sure, and anything with autism, it's fought no matter what you say. So, anything that I've said, you can find 10 studies that say it and 10 studies that say that it doesn't. So it's still pretty difficult to know.
Well, what's interesting is that you said most of the research tends to be around the paternal age and maternal age, but to me that's just pointing the finger at the parents, and might potentially be used as a scapegoat, indemnifying these environmental exposures. Where
Agreed.
Obviously there's a lot of money that goes into whether it's the use of heavy metals in various industrial applications, or these herbicides and pesticides that might be causally related. I don't think we know, but it's just interesting that most of the research dollars has gone to basically point a finger at the parents.
Yeah, which to me suggests that there's a lot going on behind the scenes when it comes to autism, which is very interesting, because I think a whole can of worms will open up if anything is even remotely definitively shown to be a significant risk factor for autism. That's going to severely affect any company or any business or any product or any chemical, because as soon as something is the fingers point at it, then everyone's going to kind of turn away from that. And so I think there's a lot of money being spent to avoid discussing whatever is related to your business, because they don't want that kind of PR, because that would be a disaster for them.
Yeah, I mean, we saw this recently with there's a company called Syngenta based out of China who produces an herbicide called paraquat. And paraquat is illegal for use in China, but it's used here in the United States. And occupational exposure to paraquat is associated with dramatically 3 to 4, somewhere between 2 and 4-fold increased risk for Parkinson's disease. And they've known for decades that this compound is easily able to enter the brain. It's a mitochondrial poison, and there is significant evidence showing that they essentially suppressed that information. There was a great article written, I forget the publication, but Carrie Gillum was the journalist who basically produced this expose showing how they had all this data, they had all this knowledge, they suppressed the information. They in fact assembled a SWAT team of scientists to suppress the information, and that's just like one herbicide associated to one disease outcome. It would be hard to imagine a world where this isn't just happening across the board.
I would guess that you're correct. I think it's happening often. It's not all nefarious, but I think that they, of course, can do the calculations, and they're so big at this point that they can do the plus minus on, all right, we're going to put this out there, we're going to hide it for as long as we can, we're going to keep it under wraps as best as we can, and then we'll get fined and it'll be okay. I mean, we've seen it with opioids, we've seen it with glyphosate, we've seen it with PFAS, we've seen it with many things at this point. So I would imagine that most big companies don't want you to know that their product can cause issues, especially when it's not extremely clear. Like it's like, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. If we don't study it, we don't know. And so they don't study it, so they don't know. Or sometimes they know, but I think a lot of the times they just get a whiff of it, and then they kind of make sure that the research never shows that thing.
Yeah, I mean, it might be these compounds might be causal to a certain genetic background. For example, certain herbicides that might be quote unquote safe for a general population seem to increase risk for Alzheimer's disease among ApoE4 carriers. This is really hard science to do, and takes years and the will, the will and the funding to be able to do. And there's just so many exposures today that I would imagine it would be really frustrating for somebody on the front line, such as yourself.
It is, but that's where I try to come back to, well, what can we actually do today as a parent, and never to put too much on parents so that they're so stressed out that they don't feel like they can do anything. At the end of the day, we're amazing creatures. We have great detoxification systems. We can handle most things. Kids are extremely resilient. And so if you are mindful with your purchases, if you're mindful with what you do in your home, what you expose your kids to, if we're cooking more, if we know what we're making them, if we're giving them good food, then that's going to get us most of the way. Because still, when you see mindful parents versus people that are not so mindful, like the health differences are so vast. And when people start to take health into their own hands, you can see their health change, you can see their conditions go away or get better. And that to me is very encouraging, because it's not a hopeless endeavor. It matters. If you care, if you're mindful, then that's going to probably be more than enough to keep your family healthy. And that to me is what I want the messaging to be to parents, is that we have so much control over it, and we really can make a huge difference. And we do make a big difference if we're just mindful with what we purchase for our home, what we buy at the grocery store, what we're doing every day, making sure that we're moving, making sure that we're not on screens too much. I mean, these are not rocket science things, but it adds up. All these little things matter, and your body can handle some chemicals and some toxins, and we always have and we always will. But I believe that we're getting to the point where it's too much, and our bodies are falling off the cliff, and it's expressing itself in whichever way that it is. And that's why we're seeing the chronic disease epidemic today.
How do you think about organic versus conventional? Like if a parent asks you, what should I be buying for my home?
I think if you can afford organic, then if you're decreasing the chemicals even a little bit, that's great. I mean, the EWG has a great list. If there's only some things that you can get, then try to get the things that are higher in pesticides. But at the end of the day, every chemical matters. Every little bit helps. And so if you are able to get things that are not sprayed in whatever chemical, it's probably better than what's sprayed in a chemical.
Yeah. No, I agree. I don't buy everything organic. I don't buy organic citrus. I don't buy organic avocados, bananas. But if it's something that I'm eating all the time, like I love apples, Honeycrisp apples. I go out of my way to buy organic Honeycrisp apples, where you're eating the peel, the skin, the whole leaf.
Yeah. I think the more you can buy real food straight from places that you know that are not spraying in all sorts of chemicals, that's the best that we can do, because there's still water, there's still chemicals in the water, there's still chemicals in the air, so we're always exposed to something. So wherever you can minimize, that's going to be helpful.
Yeah. I started washing my produce with a produce wash, which you can now find at supermarkets, because apparently there's evidence. I've looked into it, but I haven't done too deep a dive into the data showing that, like, you can use baking soda or even salt, maybe vinegar, if I recall correctly, which increases the reduction. It basically reduces the potential exposure to residues even more so than just plain water. Yeah,
we do it sometimes. I think that it's a lot for parents to kind of do that all the time and rinse everything, but I don't think there's any question that they get stuff off a little bit better, and especially for those like strawberries, things that we know have a lot of pesticides on them. It can be something that you can do to try to get some extra chemicals off, especially in the case where you have a child or a family member who has a condition. Then even more so, if you can decrease their chemical exposure, then that might be helpful for them.
Yeah. What about screen use? This is a big concern now amongst parents, rightfully so, because we're just inundated with screens, and screens have provided an easy way to pacify, an agitated child. You just put Mrs. Rachel in front of their face, as I've seen with my nieces. No shade against Mrs. Rachel; she does great content. But yeah, what do you think about that and the growing concern around addiction to these devices? Yeah, it's a big topic this year, and thanks to Jonathan Haidt's book, I think it's fantastic that we're talking about it more, because it's very clearly become a massive issue. I mean, there's two different discussions to be had: the younger kids and then the older kids. When we're talking about the 0 to 2 range, there's a lot of stress from parents because of the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines that it says 0 screen time, which is not very realistic for most parents. And I definitely get parents who come in because they're older toddlers watching something, and their 6-month-old turns their head for a second, and then they're worried they're going to turn their brain to mush, which I just try to remind parents, like, a little bit of screen time is not the end of the world. It's not the screen that's the problem. It's what's on the screen. It's what we're not doing that's the problem. So if we're not outside, if we're not getting exercise, if we're not learning actively from parents, and that's where you run into an issue. It's not the 35 seconds of a screen or watching something on a trip that I'm really overly worried about. It's the statistics that we're seeing today in the older kids, which is 7 to 9 hours on average of screen time a day. Like, wow. That, again, it's very
insane that we're at a point where 7 to 9 hours is average. It's not that you can't do your homework on a screen. It's not that you can't learn something from a screen. But if you're on it for 8 hours a day, you're not outside. You're not getting sunlight. You're not exercising. You're not moving. You're not around other people, right? That is the problem, and that's what we need to minimize. We need to get our kids moving and off of the screens for so many hours in the day. That's where I try to help parents to focus, not for 20 minutes of watching a cartoon because you need to go to the bathroom, or putting your kids in front of a screen when you're on a plane. I mean, to me, a screaming toddler for 6 hours, for 2 hours on a plane is worse than them watching a cartoon for 1 hour, especially if they're not usually doing it. Then that is not going to be the issue. And we don't need to be so worried about screens in terms of it turning our brain too much, because basically all the research says you can learn from screens. You just don't learn as well as from people. So if you're watching educational content like Sesame Street, there's a ton of research from back in the day on Sesame Street. Like, kids learn quite well and actually do better if they are watching some of those good programs. But you don't learn as well to read if you are watching a screen as opposed to your parent reading to you. So I think it's not that we can't watch screens, it's that we shouldn't replace parenting.
Yeah. And it's also really important for, as you alluded to, for kids getting outside. Like, exposure to the ambient light of the sun is really important for eye development, is it not?
Definitely. And screens, if we're watching it before bed, if it's in our room, I mean, that's where you're really running into an issue of not getting enough sleep or having issues going to sleep. That is where I try to bring the focus back, because it really stresses a lot of parents because their kids watch a cartoon. I don't know. I think that's not the end of the world, and we all watch some cartoons, and screens aren't going anywhere. So if you want to move out to the mountains and have no screen time, that's fine. I have friends that did it, but that's not realistic for most parents. So I would put my focus into making sure they're not doing too much.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you've provided this wonderful roadmap for parents for the first 3 years of life, parenting at your child's pace. Who'd you write this book for?
It's written for parents, especially new parents, pregnancy, or someone who's thinking about having a baby, or really with a young child. It is important to get to the foundations of health, to speak to new parents from day one, and that's really what I wanted to do. I wanted to get ahead of all the stresses, try to help people think through the big questions that they are going to encounter, and also to discuss health in a parenting book. I mean, most of the parenting books are written by therapists or moms, not really by pediatricians anymore, and certainly not by an integrative pediatrician. And I really wanted to have that piece in a parenting book and start with the foundations, because we're not talking about it. It's not as mainstream, because a lot of the mainstream books are from therapists, and so they have a great perspective, but it's not a health perspective. And I think that's really, really important given where we are.
Yeah, it's super important. I mean, you're not given a roadmap. I mean, I've seen with my brothers, with my youngest brother, who is now a dad of 2, that you're essentially just winging it, and you do learn on the job, so to speak. But if there's a way to sort of accelerate the progress and to make fewer, I guess, I don't know if the right word is mistakes or whatever, but I could imagine this is going to be a really valuable, invaluable resource for parents.
I really wanted to try to help de-stress parents, and that's the big goal. And it's not to tell people what to do. I mean, I certainly give my opinion in places, but it's important to help parents to know the big questions that are going to come up, because these are the big questions that I get in my office every day. And so it's just important to think through these questions and kind of understand that there isn't one right way to do almost anything. And I think that helps de-stress parents, and also just reminding parents that you don't need a lot of stuff. Like, there's a lot of fear about, I don't have all the right stuff, I'm not going to do the right thing. And there really isn't any such thing. I mean, you look at other countries like Finland, and they give them a cardboard box with some diapers and some wipes, and they say good luck, when you go home, and the baby sleeps in the cardboard box, and they're doing much better than we are. So we don't need everything. We don't need to be worried so much about the nursery. You're not even going to be in the nursery for a few months anyways, because the baby's probably going to sleep in your room. So if you want to get your nursery ready, great. But put your worry where it's important, for being there, for caring, for loving your baby. That's what matters, not all the stuff that you have.
Is there any way around the sleep loss that occurs as a result of being a new parent?
Not really.
Or is that just
that's part of the deal. I mean, I guess what people have like night nurses and things like that, but I'm not even sure if that's that great. But realistically, your baby's going to wake up. That's a part of the first couple of weeks and months, and it's just something that's a part of being a parent.
How have we adapted to that? I mean, it just seems like if we know that sleep is so important for health, how did that pass through,
I don't know how the genetics got through on
millennia
that.
of natural selection? Yeah.
I guess it's just trying to keep your baby alive, and the babies that wake their parents up get more food, and so they do that. I don't know. I don't know why. I'm not sure why all of a sudden when you have a new baby, it's like we shouldn't sleep. Why they didn't just create babies so they could sleep 8 hours, but who knows?
I've heard, I don't know if this is like complete pseudoscience, but that women are less, they become more adapted to that. Like their hormone systems, like
I don't know.
orient themselves towards sleep loss in a way that is less harmful as it would be otherwise during that period.
I haven't heard that. Maybe it's true, but I mean, I think you just adapt because you have no choice. I mean, I did residency, so you have some training when you go to residency that you're not sleeping, but it's still not the same. I mean, you cannot prepare for the waking up every 2 or 3 hours. It is tough, and that first month is very tough in terms of the sleep loss. But everybody does it and has done it, so we all get through it. And I mean, if anything, that's an important discussion to be had around supporting parents, supporting moms, especially in terms of those first few weeks, because we don't give families nearly enough support in America for sure, compared to other countries, and we have to realize just what we are going to go through, so that way we can be supported and help parents to get through those first few months in a better way. Yeah,
makes a lot of sense. Well, thanks for coming in. Where can people pick up your book? Where can they find you on social media if they want to connect and learn more?
Sure. So they can find me on Instagram or Twitter, X at Dr. Joel Gator, or they could get the book on Amazon or everywhere the books are sold, or parentingatyourchildspace.com.
Love it. Last question that gets asked to everybody on the show. What does living a genius life mean to you?
Living a genius life. Well, I think that's living a life that involves wellness, health, happiness, doing the things that you absolutely love, and finding your inner true self.
Love it. Thanks, Dr. Gator. Thanks for coming in. Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.